The morning mist hung heavy over Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, on September 15, 1972, when 17-year-old Rebecca Anne Hartwell vanished without a trace from her family's modest home on Sycamore Lane. What the authorities discovered in her bedroom 3 days later would send shockwaves through the tight-knit Christian community and remain an unsolved mystery for 50 years, until a renovation project in 2022 finally revealed the stunning truth about what really happened to the beloved pastor's daughter. Rebecca was the pride and joy of Willowbrook Springs Community Church, where her father, Reverend Thomas Nathaniel Morrison, had served as senior pastor for 12 years. With her golden blonde hair that cascaded in gentle waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of spring sky, Rebecca possessed a natural beauty that was enhanced by an inner radiance that seemed to glow from her very soul. But it wasn't her physical beauty that made Rebecca special, it was her unwavering faith, her compassionate heart, and her extraordinary gift for bringing peace to troubled souls. At 17, Rebecca was already leading the youth ministry, organizing food drives for struggling families, and spending her weekends visiting elderly church members who had no family nearby. She carried herself with a grace and maturity that belied her young age, and everyone in Willowbrook Springs agreed that Rebecca Morrison was destined for greatness in God's kingdom. The Morrison family lived in the white clapboard parsonage adjacent to the church, a charming two-story home with a wraparound porch adorned with hanging baskets of pink petunias that Rebecca tended with loving care. Her mother, Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, was the church organist and Sunday school coordinator, a gentle woman with graying brown hair and kind eyes who had devoted her life to supporting her husband's ministry and raising their 3 children with strong Christian values. Rebecca was the eldest, followed by her brother Jonathan Samuel Morrison, 15, and her youngest sister, Sarah Grace Morrison, 13. The Morrison children were well known throughout the community for their polite manners, academic excellence, and active participation in church activities. But Rebecca held a special place in everyone's heart. She was the one who never seemed to struggle with doubt, never went through a rebellious phase, and never failed to find the right words to comfort someone in distress. On the morning of September 15, 1972, Margaret Morrison knocked gently on Rebecca's bedroom door at 6:30 a.m., as was their daily routine. Rebecca always rose early for personal prayer and Bible study before helping her mother prepare breakfast for the family. When she received no response to her knock, Margaret quietly opened the door, expecting to find her daughter deep in prayer or perhaps still sleeping after a late night of studying for her upcoming college entrance exams. Instead, Margaret Morrison found Rebecca's bed unslept in, the handmade quilt pulled tight and neat as if it had never been disturbed. Rebecca's clothes from the previous day were folded neatly on her dresser chair, and her nightgown was missing from its usual place on the bedpost. More puzzling still, Rebecca's beloved Bible, a leather-bound King James version that had been her confirmation gift 3 years earlier, lay open on her desk to Psalm 139, with verses 23 and 24 highlighted in yellow. "Search me, O God, and know my heart, try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Margaret's first instinct was that Rebecca had risen even earlier than usual and was perhaps in the church sanctuary praying, something she occasionally did when she felt particularly burdened about something. But a thorough search of the church building and the surrounding grounds revealed no sign of Rebecca. Her bicycle was still in the garage, her purse was in its usual place on her dresser, and most troubling of all, her shoes were lined up neatly by her bedroom door. She had apparently left the house barefoot. Reverend Morrison was leading the weekly men's prayer breakfast at the church when Margaret burst through the fellowship hall doors, her face pale with panic. "Thomas," she called out, her voice trembling, "Rebecca is gone. Her bed wasn't slept in, and I can't find her anywhere." The prayer breakfast immediately transformed into a search party. Every man present dropped his coffee cup and rushed out to comb the immediate area around the church and parsonage. Word spread quickly through Willowbrook Springs, and by 8 a.m., nearly 100 volunteers had gathered to search for the pastor's missing daughter. Sheriff Douglas Robert Caldwell, a 45-year-old man with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, arrived at the Morrison home within 20 minutes of receiving the call. Sheriff Caldwell had known the Morrison family since their arrival in Willowbrook Springs, and he had watched Rebecca grow from a precocious 5-year-old into the remarkable young woman she had become. The thought that anything harmful might have happened to her in his jurisdiction was deeply troubling to him. Reverend Morrison, Sheriff Caldwell said as he surveyed Rebecca's untouched bedroom, "I need you to think carefully about yesterday. Did Rebecca seem troubled about anything? Had she mentioned being afraid of someone or planning to meet anyone?" Thomas Morrison ran his hands through his graying brown hair, struggling to recall any detail that might provide a clue to his daughter's disappearance. "She seemed perfectly normal at dinner," he said slowly. "We discussed her college applications. She's been accepted to 3 different Christian universities and was trying to decide which one felt like God's calling for her life. She mentioned wanting to major in counseling psychology so she could help people work through their spiritual struggles." Margaret Morrison sat on Rebecca's bed, clutching her daughter's Bible to her chest. "She did seem thoughtful yesterday evening," she added. "After dinner, she spent a long time on the front porch swing, just looking up at the stars. When I asked if she was all right, she said she was praying about something important but wasn't ready to talk about it yet." Sheriff Caldwell made careful notes of every detail while his deputy, James William Patterson, began processing Rebecca's room as a potential crime scene. Deputy Patterson was a methodical young man of 28 who had joined the sheriff's department 2 years earlier after completing his criminal justice degree at the University of Tennessee. He photographed everything in Rebecca's room exactly as it had been found, dusted for fingerprints, and carefully bagged any potential evidence. The search for Rebecca expanded throughout the day, with volunteers checking every barn, shed, creek, and wooded area within a 5-mile radius of Willowbrook Springs. The Tennessee State Police were notified, and Detective Lieutenant Michael Andrew Stevens arrived from Nashville to assist with the investigation. Detective Stevens was a seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, and his presence brought both hope and a sobering reality to the situation. If the state police were involved, this was being treated as more than a simple runaway case. As the sun began to set on September 15 with no sign of Rebecca, the community gathered at Willowbrook Springs Community Church for an emergency prayer service. The sanctuary, which normally held about 200 people comfortably, was packed beyond capacity with concerned citizens, many of whom had never set foot in the church before but who felt compelled to join in the search for answers. Reverend Morrison stood at the pulpit where he had delivered hundreds of sermons over the years, but tonight he struggled to find words that made sense of his family's nightmare. "Friends," he began, his voice breaking with emotion, "my daughter Rebecca has always been a light in this community. She has touched so many lives with her kindness, her wisdom, and her unshakable faith in God's goodness. Tonight, I'm asking you to help me hold on to that same faith, even when we cannot understand what's happening." The congregation joined hands and prayed with an intensity that seemed to make the very walls of the church vibrate with spiritual energy. Many people wept openly as they pleaded with God to keep Rebecca safe and bring her home to her family. The prayer service lasted nearly 3 hours, and when it finally concluded, dozens of volunteers committed to continue searching throughout the night. It was during this overnight search that the first truly disturbing discovery was made. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on September 16, search volunteer Robert Charles Thornton found Rebecca's nightgown hanging from a tree branch about 2 miles from the Morrison home, near the banks of Willowbrook Creek. The white cotton gown was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, and it had been placed deliberately on the branch, not caught there accidentally. Sheriff Caldwell immediately sealed off the area and called for additional state police investigators and forensic specialists. The discovery of the blood-stained nightgown transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a potential homicide, a reality that hit the Morrison family and the entire community like a physical blow. Margaret Morrison collapsed when Sheriff Caldwell delivered the news, her anguished cries echoing through the parsonage as neighbors rushed to provide comfort and support. "My baby girl," Margaret sobbed, clutching Rebecca's Bible to her chest. "What monster would hurt my innocent baby girl?" The sight of the gentle church organist reduced to such devastating grief moved even the most hardened law enforcement officers to tears. Reverend Morrison stood like a stone pillar beside his wife, his jaw clenched in determination as he struggled to maintain his composure for the sake of his remaining children and his congregation. Jonathan and Sarah Morrison, ages 15 and 13 respectively, sat huddled together on the living room couch, their young faces pale with shock and confusion. They had overheard enough of the adults' conversations to understand that their beloved older sister was likely dead, but their minds couldn't fully process the horrific reality of murder in their peaceful community. "Dad," Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "why would anyone want to hurt Rebecca? She never did anything wrong to anyone." The boy's innocent question hung in the air like a prayer, highlighting the senselessness of violence against someone who had dedicated her young life to serving others and spreading God's love. Dr. Amanda Claire Whitfield, the state's forensic specialist, arrived in Willowbrook Springs at dawn on September 16 to examine the nightgown and the surrounding area. Dr. Whitfield was a meticulous woman in her mid-30s who had earned her reputation by solving several high-profile cases through careful analysis of physical evidence. Her preliminary examination of the nightgown revealed that the blood was human and appeared to be consistent with someone Rebecca's age and size, though DNA testing was not available in 1972 to make a definitive identification. As Dr. Whitfield worked at the creek site, word of the discovery spread throughout Willowbrook Springs like wildfire. The local diner, Morrison's Five and Dime store, and the post office buzzed with hushed conversations as residents struggled to comprehend that their safe, quiet community had been shattered by violence. Many people had known Rebecca since she was a small child, had watched her grow into a remarkable young woman, and the thought that someone had deliberately harmed her was almost too painful to bear. Mrs. Eleanor Catherine Winters, the 70-year-old proprietor of Winters Bakery, stood behind her counter with tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks as she spoke with customers. "That sweet child used to come in here every Saturday morning to buy donuts for the church coffee hour," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She always insisted on paying with her own pocket money, said it was her way of contributing to the fellowship. Who could be evil enough to hurt someone so pure and good?" The impact on Willowbrook Springs High School was particularly devastating. Principal Robert James Harrison called an emergency assembly to address the student body, many of whom were Rebecca's friends and classmates. The auditorium was filled with teenagers wiping away tears as counselors attempted to help them process their grief and fear. "Rebecca Morrison was one of the finest young people it has been my privilege to know," Principal Harrison told the assembled students, his own voice breaking with emotion. "She exemplified everything we hope to instill in our students: kindness, integrity, academic excellence, and a commitment to serving others. While we mourn her loss, we must also celebrate the remarkable impact she had on all of our lives." Jennifer Marie Blackwood sat in the front row of the auditorium, her face streaked with tears as she listened to the principal's words. As Rebecca's best friend, Jennifer felt as though a part of her own soul had been ripped away. The two girls had shared everything: their dreams for the future, their fears and insecurities, their faith journey, and their excitement about starting college together the following year. More troubling still was Dr. Whitfield's assessment that the placement of the nightgown appeared to be deliberate. Someone had wanted it to be found. The fabric wasn't weathered enough to have been hanging there for more than a few hours, and the way it was positioned on the branch suggested it had been placed there carefully, not thrown hastily. "This feels like a message," Dr. Whitfield told Detective Stevens privately as they examined the scene. "Someone wanted us to find this, and they wanted us to understand that Rebecca is likely dead. But something about this doesn't feel right. The positioning is too neat, too staged. Most killers who leave evidence behind do so accidentally or in panic. This feels calculated." As the investigation entered its third day, attention focused intensely on Rebecca's personal relationships and daily activities. Detective Stevens interviewed every student at Willowbrook Springs High School, every member of the youth group at church, and every adult who had regular contact with Rebecca. What emerged was a portrait of a young woman who was universally loved and respected, with no known enemies and no indication of any romantic relationships that might have gone wrong. The interviews revealed the extraordinary depth of Rebecca's impact on her community. Mrs. Dorothy Mae Fletcher, Rebecca's sophomore English teacher, described her as the most compassionate and intellectually curious student I've ever had the privilege to teach. She went on to explain how Rebecca had organized a reading program for struggling students, volunteering her own time to tutor classmates who were falling behind. "Rebecca never made anyone feel inferior or stupid," Mrs. Fletcher explained to Detective Stevens, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She had this remarkable gift for meeting people where they were and helping them believe in themselves. Just last month, she helped Tommy Rodriguez, who has severe dyslexia, finally understand Shakespeare. The boy had been failing my class, but Rebecca worked with him every day after school until something clicked. When Tommy finally grasped the meaning of Romeo and Juliet, he cried with joy, and so did Rebecca. The youth pastor at Willowbrook Springs Community Church, Reverend Mark Anthony Sullivan, provided additional insight into Rebecca's character during his interview. Rebecca had what I can only describe as an old soul, he told Detective Stevens. She possessed a spiritual maturity that was remarkable in someone so young. The other teenagers looked up to her not because she was preachy or judgmental, but because she lived her faith so authentically. Reverend Sullivan went on to describe how Rebecca had been planning a summer mission trip to Appalachian communities, organizing fundraisers, and recruiting volunteers to help build homes for families in need. She had already raised over $300 through bake sales and car washes, he explained. Her enthusiasm was infectious. Even teenagers who rarely came to church were getting involved in the project because Rebecca had inspired them to care about helping others. Rebecca's biology teacher, Mr. Daniel Christopher Wade, spoke about her academic achievements and her plans for college. Rebecca was accepted to 3 different universities with full scholarships, he told investigators. She could have chosen any path she wanted, pre-med, engineering, law, but she was determined to study counseling psychology because she wanted to help people work through emotional and spiritual struggles. Mr. Wade's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. Just 2 weeks before she disappeared, Rebecca stayed after class to ask me about careers in forensic psychology. She said she had become interested in understanding the criminal mind, what makes people choose evil over good. I encouraged her to pursue that interest, thinking it would make her an even more effective counselor. Now I can't help but wonder if her interest in understanding evil somehow put her in danger. The investigation team also interviewed Rebecca's younger siblings, Jonathan and Sarah, hoping to learn more about her state of mind in the days before her disappearance. Both children were articulate and intelligent, despite their grief, and they provided valuable insights into their sister's recent behavior. Rebecca had been staying up really late the past few weeks, 13-year-old Sarah told Detective Stevens during a gentle interview conducted in the presence of her parents. I could see light under her bedroom door sometimes when I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. When I asked her about it, she said she was working on something important for God, but that she couldn't talk about it yet. 15-year-old Jonathan added, Rebecca had been asking weird questions lately about how banks work and how money gets moved around. She wanted to know about church finances and how donations were handled. Dad thought she was just being responsible since she was going to study business in college, but now it seems like maybe she was investigating something. The boy's observation sent a chill through the interview room. If Rebecca had been asking questions about financial matters, it suggested that she might have stumbled upon some kind of irregularity or wrongdoing that could have put her in danger. Rebecca's closest friend, Jennifer Marie Blackwood, provided what would prove to be the most significant information in the case. Jennifer was 17, the daughter of the town's only doctor, and had been Rebecca's constant companion since elementary school. The 2 girls shared everything with each other, and if anyone would know what had been troubling Rebecca, it would be Jennifer. Rebecca had been acting strange for about 2 weeks before she disappeared, Jennifer told Detective Stevens during her interview, her voice barely above a whisper as tears streamed down her face. She kept saying she had discovered something that was breaking her heart but that she needed to pray about how to handle it. I begged her to tell me what it was, but she said she couldn't talk about it until she was sure she was doing the right thing. Jennifer's hands shook as she continued her account. The last time I saw Rebecca was after youth group on Wednesday night, September 13th. She seemed really worried about something, kept looking around like she was afraid someone might be watching us. When I asked her what was wrong, she hugged me really tight and said, Jennifer, promise me that if anything happens to me, you'll remember that I love you and I love God, and that everything I'm doing is to protect people who can't protect themselves. The interview with Jennifer revealed additional disturbing details about Rebecca's recent behavior. About a week before she disappeared, Rebecca asked me if I knew anything about my father's work at the hospital, Jennifer continued. She wanted to know about the new wing that was being built and where the money was coming from. I thought it was a strange question, but Rebecca was always interested in community projects. Jennifer also mentioned that Rebecca had been carrying a small camera with her everywhere she went, an old Kodak Instamatic that had belonged to her grandmother. She said she was working on a photography project for church, but she was very secretive about it. Usually Rebecca shared everything with me, but she wouldn't let me see any of the pictures she was taking. The revelation about the camera was particularly significant because no camera had been found in Rebecca's room or anywhere else in the Morrison home. If Rebecca had been documenting something with photographs, those images could be crucial evidence, if they could be found. Detective Stevens expanded the search to include local photo development shops, hoping to find out if Rebecca had recently developed any film. The investigation led them to Peterson's photography studio, a small shop downtown where many residents took their film to be processed. Mr. Carl Wilhelm Peterson, the shop's elderly owner, remembered Rebecca well. "That sweet Morrison girl brought in 3 rolls of film about 10 days ago," he told investigators. "She paid for rush processing and asked me to be very careful with them because they were important. When she came back to pick them up, she seemed nervous and kept looking over her shoulder like she thought someone might be following her." Peterson went on to explain that Rebecca had specifically requested that no duplicates be made of the photographs and that the negatives be returned to her along with the prints. "She paid extra for that service," he noted. "Most folks don't bother with getting their negatives back, but she insisted it was important." The fact that Rebecca had been so careful about controlling access to her photographs suggested that she had captured something sensitive or potentially dangerous. The question now was, where were those photographs, and what did they show? As the search for Rebecca's missing camera and photographs intensified, Detective Stevens received an unexpected break in the case. Mrs. Vivian Rose Carmichael, a retired schoolteacher who lived across the street from the Morrison parsonage, came forward with information that she had initially dismissed as unimportant. Jennifer's revelation added a new dimension to the investigation. If Rebecca had discovered something troubling, something significant enough to cause her deep distress, it was possible that her disappearance was connected to whatever secret she had uncovered. But what could a 17-year-old pastor's daughter have discovered that would put her life in danger? The answer to that question would not come for 50 years. On September 18, 1972, exactly 3 days after Rebecca's disappearance, Sheriff Caldwell made the decision to conduct a more thorough search of Rebecca's bedroom. Previous searches had focused on obvious signs of struggle or forced entry, but now investigators were looking for anything that might provide insight into Rebecca's state of mind or recent activities. The Morrison family had been staying with neighbors since the discovery of Rebecca's nightgown, unable to bear remaining in the house where their daughter had last been seen alive. Reverend Morrison accompanied the investigators as they methodically examined every inch of Rebecca's room, hoping against hope that some clue had been overlooked that might lead them to his daughter. Rebecca's bedroom was a reflection of her character, neat, organized, and filled with evidence of her many interests and activities. The walls were covered with inspirational Bible verses written in her careful handwriting, photographs of mission trips and youth group activities, and academic awards from her years at Willowbrook Springs High School. Her bookshelf contained a mixture of classic literature, theology texts, and college preparation guides, all meticulously organized and clearly well-read. It was Deputy Patterson who made the discovery that would haunt Willowbrook Springs for the next 5 decades. While examining Rebecca's desk more carefully, he noticed that one of the drawers seemed shallower than it should be, given the depth of the desk. Using a thin knife blade, he was able to pry up what turned out to be a false bottom in the drawer. "Sheriff," Deputy Patterson called out, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension, "you need to see this." Hidden beneath the false bottom was a manila envelope containing photographs, letters, and documents that would shock the entire community and forever change how the people of Willowbrook Springs viewed their trusted leaders and institutions. As Sheriff Caldwell carefully removed the contents of the envelope, Reverend Morrison leaned forward to see what his daughter had hidden with such care. The photographs were the most immediately disturbing, black and white images that appeared to have been taken secretly, showing several prominent men in the community engaged in what appeared to be some kind of ritual or ceremony. The men were dressed in robes and hoods, standing around what looked like an altar with strange symbols carved into it. The setting appeared to be the basement of a building, though it was difficult to identify the specific location from the photographs. "My God," Reverend Morrison whispered, his face draining of color as he examined the images. "What is this? What has Rebecca uncovered?" More shocking still were the identities of the men in the photographs. Even with the hoods and robes, Deputy Patterson could identify several of them by their build, posture, and distinctive features. Mayor Harrison Frederick Ashford, a respected businessman who had served the community for 8 years, Bank President Vincent Theodore Chamberlain, whose family had been pillars of the community for 3 generations, and most devastating of all, Dr. William Alexander Blackwood, Jennifer's father and the town's most trusted physician. "I know these men," Reverend Morrison said, his voice filled with horror and disbelief. "They attend our church. Their families are part of our congregation. How could they be involved in something like this?" The letters in the envelope were even more damning. They appeared to be correspondence between the men in the photographs, discussing meetings, rituals, and what they referred to as the sacred work. The language was cryptic but clearly referenced activities that were far removed from the Christian values that these men publicly espoused. One letter, written in Mayor Ashford's distinctive handwriting, discussed the need for discretion during the equinox ceremony, and mentioned payments from the hospital fund to ensure continued cooperation. Another, signed with Dr. Blackwood's initials, referred to the young Morrison girl asking too many questions, and suggested that measures might need to be taken to ensure her silence. But it was the documents that provided the most concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Rebecca had somehow obtained financial records showing that significant amounts of money had been diverted from various community organizations, the hospital fund, the school district budget, even the church building fund, into private accounts controlled by members of what appeared to be a secret society. The evidence showed a pattern of embezzlement that had been going on for years, with hundreds of thousands of dollars being stolen from the community through a complex network of false invoices, phantom employees, and fraudulent contracts. The stolen money appeared to be funding not only lavish lifestyles for the conspirators but also elaborate rituals and ceremonies that mocked the Christian faith that formed the foundation of Willowbrook Springs society. Detective Stevens stared at the evidence spread across Sheriff Caldwell's desk, struggling to process the implications. Rebecca discovered that some of the most respected men in this community were involved in embezzlement and some kind of occult activities, he said slowly. And if they knew she had this evidence, they would have been desperate to silence her, Sheriff Caldwell finished grimly. The question is, which one of them did it, and where is Rebecca's body? Reverend Morrison sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that his daughter had died because she had tried to expose corruption and evil in their community. She was just 17 years old, he said, his voice breaking. How did she manage to uncover all of this? And why didn't she come to me for help? Deputy Patterson found a partial answer to that question when he discovered a handwritten note tucked behind one of the photographs. In Rebecca's careful script, she had written, "I can't tell Dad about this yet because Pastor Sullivan warned me that there might be people in the church who are involved. I need more proof before I can trust anyone with this information. If something happens to me, these documents will prove that evil has infiltrated our community and that justice must be served." The reference to Pastor Sullivan, the youth pastor who had worked closely with Rebecca, sent another chill through the room. Had the conspiracy extended even into the church leadership? How many people in positions of trust had betrayed the community's faith? The investigation took on new urgency as law enforcement officials realized they were dealing with what appeared to be an organized conspiracy involving multiple suspects with significant power and influence in the community. Detective Stevens called for additional resources from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and within 24 hours, Willowbrook Springs was swarming with state investigators, forensic specialists, and federal agents. The arrival of so many law enforcement officers created a palpable sense of fear and uncertainty throughout the community. Residents who had lived peacefully in Willowbrook Springs for decades suddenly found themselves wondering if they could trust their neighbors, their leaders, or even their fellow church members. The foundation of their society, built on Christian values, civic duty, and mutual trust, had been shattered by the revelation that corruption and evil had been operating in their midst for years. Special Agent Catherine Rose Manning of the FBI arrived on September 20 to coordinate the federal investigation. Agent Manning was a formidable woman in her early 40s who specialized in organized crime and public corruption cases. She had seen enough corruption in small communities to know that the evidence Rebecca had uncovered likely represented only the tip of the iceberg. "We're dealing with a conspiracy that has probably been operating for years," Agent Manning told the assembled law enforcement team during their first briefing at the Willowbrook Springs City Hall. These men had significant financial incentives to keep their activities secret, and they clearly had the resources and connections to cover their tracks. If Rebecca Morrison threatened to expose them, they would have viewed her as an existential threat. Agent Manning's team immediately began the process of obtaining federal warrants to search the homes, businesses, and financial records of all the men identified in Rebecca's photographs. The scope of the investigation expanded to include not only the potential murder of Rebecca Morrison but also federal charges of conspiracy, money laundering, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The investigation expanded to examine every aspect of the suspects' lives and activities. Federal agents obtained warrants to search their homes, businesses, and financial records. What they discovered was a complex web of financial fraud that had been operating for nearly a decade, with the stolen money being used to fund lavish lifestyles and secretive activities. Mayor Ashford's home yielded the most damning physical evidence, a basement room that matched the setting in Rebecca's photographs, complete with the strange altar and ritual paraphernalia. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, agents discovered robes, ceremonial daggers, and books on occult practices that contradicted everything these men claimed to believe publicly. The basement also contained detailed records of the group's activities, including membership lists, financial records, and disturbing accounts of rituals that involved elements of Satanism and paganism. The documents revealed that the conspiracy extended beyond simple financial fraud. These men had been engaged in activities that they believed gave them power and control over their community. Dr. Blackwood's medical practice provided another piece of the puzzle. Financial records showed that he had been billing insurance companies for procedures that were never performed and medications that were never prescribed, generating thousands of dollars in fraudulent income. More disturbing still, his medical records showed patterns of prescribing powerful sedatives and other drugs that could be used to incapacitate someone. In Dr. Blackwood's office safe, investigators found vials of various drugs, including several that were not approved for general medical use. Chemical analysis revealed that some of these substances were powerful hallucinogens and sedatives that could be used to render a person unconscious or compliant. The discovery raised horrifying questions about whether Rebecca had been drugged before her murder. Bank President Chamberlain's institution was revealed to be the central hub of the money laundering operation. The men had been using the bank to move stolen funds through a series of fake accounts and shell companies, making it nearly impossible to trace the money back to its original sources. Chamberlain's personal office contained a sophisticated system of hidden safes and secret compartments where documents related to the conspiracy were stored. Financial records showed that over a period of 8 years, the group had embezzled more than $500,000 from various community organizations and government funds. As the scope of the corruption became clear, the investigation faced a sobering reality. If these men were willing to kill to protect their secrets, Rebecca Morrison was almost certainly dead. But despite extensive searches of properties connected to all the suspects, investigators could find no trace of Rebecca's body. The community response to the unfolding scandal was one of shock, anger, and betrayal. Many residents who had trusted these men with their lives, their money, and their children's futures felt deeply violated by the revelation of their criminal activities. The arrests came on October 15, 1972, exactly 1 month after Rebecca's disappearance. Federal agents simultaneously arrested Mayor Ashford, Dr. Blackwood, and Bank President Chamberlain on charges of conspiracy, embezzlement, and murder. A fourth man, hardware store owner Samuel Benjamin Crawford, was arrested later that day when evidence was found linking him to the financial conspiracy. The arrest sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Springs. These were men who had been trusted with the community's most important institutions, men who attended church regularly, men whose families had been part of the town's foundation for generations. The revelation that they had been leading secret lives involving financial fraud and occult practices was almost too much for the community to process. Reverend Morrison faced the most difficult challenge of his ministry as he tried to help his congregation understand how such evil could exist in their midst while continuing to grieve the loss of his own daughter. His sermons during this period focused on themes of hidden sin, the danger of trusting in earthly leaders rather than God, and the importance of seeking truth even when it was painful. "My daughter Rebecca died because she chose truth over comfort," he said during one particularly powerful sermon. She could have ignored what she discovered, could have decided it wasn't her responsibility to expose the corruption she found. But Rebecca knew that God calls us to be lights in the darkness, even when that light reveals things we would rather not see. The legal proceedings against the four men stretched on for months, complicated by their wealth, influence, and ability to hire the best defense attorneys money could buy. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Helen Victoria Sinclair, faced the challenge of proving murder without a body and without any witnesses to the actual crime. The breakthrough came when Dr. Blackwood, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a life sentence. His confession revealed the full scope of what had happened to Rebecca Morrison and where her body could be found. According to Dr. Blackwood's statement, Rebecca had been gathering evidence against the group for several weeks before her disappearance. She had somehow learned about their secret meetings and had been systematically photographing their activities and copying financial documents. The men became aware of her investigation when they noticed that items were missing from their meeting place and when bank records showed unauthorized access to certain accounts. On the evening of September 14, 1972, Mayor Ashford had confronted Rebecca at her home while her family was attending a church board meeting. He had tried to convince her to remain silent about what she had discovered, offering her money for college in exchange for her discretion. When Rebecca refused and threatened to turn over her evidence to the authorities, Ashford had injected her with a powerful sedative that Dr. Blackwood had provided. The men had then transported Rebecca to an abandoned mine shaft about 20 miles outside of Willowbrook Springs, hoping to make it appear that she had died in an accidental fall. But when the sedative wore off and Rebecca regained consciousness, she had fought desperately to escape, forcing the men to kill her more directly. They had then staged the scene at Willowbrook Creek, leaving her nightgown where it would be found to suggest that she had been killed near the water. Dr. Blackwood led investigators to the mine shaft where Rebecca's body had been hidden for months. The recovery of her remains was a grim conclusion to a case that had captivated the entire state of Tennessee. Rebecca Morrison was finally laid to rest on March 15, 1973, in a funeral service that drew thousands of mourners from across the region. All four men involved in Rebecca's murder were ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Mayor Ashford died behind bars in 1987, Dr. Blackwood in 1994, Bank President Chamberlain in 2001, and Samuel Crawford in 2009. None of them ever expressed genuine remorse for their crimes, maintaining until their deaths that they had been protecting the community from what they claimed was Rebecca's misguided interference in adult affairs. The Morrison family left Willowbrook Springs 6 months after Rebecca's funeral, unable to bear the memories that seemed to haunt every corner of their former home. Reverend Morrison accepted a position at a church in North Carolina, where he spent the remainder of his ministry helping other families who had lost children to violence. He died in 2003, having never fully recovered from the loss of his beloved daughter. Margaret Morrison lived until 2015, spending her final years writing a book about Rebecca's life and the importance of speaking truth even when it comes at great personal cost. Jonathan Morrison became a federal prosecutor specializing in public corruption cases, dedicating his career to ensuring that other communities wouldn't suffer as Willowbrook Springs had. Sarah Morrison became a counselor who worked with families of murder victims, carrying on her sister's legacy of helping others through their darkest hours. The Morrison family parsonage stood empty for several years after their departure, as subsequent pastors found other housing arrangements. The house gradually fell into disrepair, becoming a painful reminder of the tragedy that had torn the community apart. In 1985, the property was sold to a local family who renovated it extensively, hoping to give the old house new life and new memories. For 50 years, Rebecca Morrison's story remained a cautionary tale told in Willowbrook Springs about the dangers of corruption and the importance of moral courage. Her sacrifice had exposed a network of crime that had been poisoning the community for years, and while her death was a terrible price to pay for that truth, many believed that her courage had ultimately saved Willowbrook Springs from even greater harm. But in 2022, 50 years after Rebecca's disappearance, a renovation project at the old Morrison parsonage would reveal one final secret that Rebecca had left behind, a secret that would provide ultimate proof of her extraordinary faith and wisdom, even in the face of certain death. The new owners of the Morrison parsonage, David and Patricia Anne Sullivan, were a young couple with two small children who had moved to Willowbrook Springs for David's job as the town's new veterinarian. They had purchased the property in 2020, drawn by its historic charm and beautiful location adjacent to the church grounds. Over the next 2 years, they had lovingly restored the house, preserving its original character while modernizing it for contemporary family life. In the spring of 2022, the Sullivans decided to convert the small bedroom that had once been Rebecca's into a nursery for their expected third child. The room had remained largely unchanged since the Morrison family's departure, with the same hardwood floors, the same built-in bookcases, and the same window seat where Rebecca had spent countless hours reading her Bible and writing in her diary. It was Patricia Sullivan who made the discovery that would complete Rebecca Morrison's story. While cleaning out the built-in bookcases to prepare for painting, she noticed that one of the shelves seemed oddly shallow compared to the others. Upon closer examination, she realized that there was a hidden compartment behind the back panel of the bookcase. Inside the compartment, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and decay, was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Rebecca Morrison. The journal contained entries spanning the final months of Rebecca's life, documenting not only her investigation into the corruption that was plaguing Willowbrook Springs but also her spiritual journey as she grappled with the knowledge of evil in her community. Patricia Sullivan immediately contacted Sheriff's Department, and within hours, the journal was in the hands of Detective Lieutenant Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, who had become something of an expert on the Rebecca Morrison case during her tenure with the department. Detective Rodriguez had grown up hearing the story of Rebecca's courage and had always been moved by the young woman's willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. The journal entries revealed a Rebecca Morrison who was even more remarkable than anyone had previously known. Rather than simply stumbling upon evidence of corruption, Rebecca had been conducting a systematic investigation for months, carefully documenting financial irregularities and suspicious activities that she had noticed in her various volunteer roles throughout the community. Her entries showed a young woman wrestling with the enormous burden of knowledge she carried. June 15, 1972, I discovered today that the money raised for the new hospital wing has been diverted to private accounts. Dr. Blackwood has been stealing from sick people who need medical care. How can someone who took an oath to help people be so evil? I've been praying about what to do. I know I have to expose this, but I'm afraid of what it might mean for Jennifer and her family. July 3, 1972, Mayor Ashford has been taking money from the school budget. Children in our community are being denied educational opportunities so that he can live in luxury. I have photographs now, and financial documents. The evidence is clear. But there are more people involved than I originally thought. This goes deeper than I imagined. August 20, 1972, I followed them to their meeting last night. What I saw there was the most evil thing I have ever witnessed in my life. These men are not just thieves, they are worshipping Satan himself. They have defiled God's creation with their rituals and their sacrifices. I understand now why God has allowed me to discover their secrets. He is calling me to be his instrument of justice. The final entries in the journal were the most haunting, revealing that Rebecca had known her life was in danger but had continued her work anyway. September 10, 1972, they know I have evidence against them. Mayor Ashford tried to approach me after church today, asking casual questions about what I've been doing with my time. I can see the fear in his eyes. They're planning something, but I'm not afraid. God is with me, and he will use even my death to expose their evil if that's his will. September 14, 1972, this may be my final entry. I've hidden copies of all evidence in 3 different locations, including this journal. If something happens to me, the truth will still come to light. I've written letters to be delivered to the state police, the FBI, and the newspapers. The darkness cannot overcome the light, no matter how hard it tries. I love my family, and I pray they will understand that I had to do what was right, even if it cost me everything. But the most extraordinary discovery in Rebecca's journal was not her documentation of the corruption or even her preparation for possible death. It was her final entry, written in a different ink and apparently added after she had been confronted by Mayor Ashford on the evening of September 14. I am writing this while they think I am unconscious from the drug Dr. Blackwood gave me. God has given me strength to remain partially aware, and I can hear them planning to kill me. I am not afraid, because I know that Jesus is with me in this valley of the shadow of death. I forgive Mayor Ashford, Dr. Blackwood, Mr. Chamberlain, and Mr. Crawford for what they are about to do to me. I pray that someday they will turn away from their evil and find God's forgiveness. I also pray that my death will not be in vain, that it will lead to justice for all the people they have hurt. To my family, I love you more than words can say. Do not mourn for me, but rejoice that I was able to serve God's purpose. The truth will prevail, and light will overcome darkness. This I believe with all my heart. The discovery of Rebecca's journal provided final confirmation of her extraordinary character and faith. Even facing certain death, she had maintained her compassion for her killers and her unwavering belief in God's ultimate justice. The journal also revealed the locations of the other evidence caches that Rebecca had hidden, leading to the recovery of additional documents that further corroborated the extent of the corruption that had plagued Willowbrook Springs. Detective Rodriguez worked with historians and community leaders to ensure that Rebecca's journal was properly preserved and that her story would be told completely and accurately for future generations. The journal was placed in the Willowbrook Springs Historical Society, where it became the centerpiece of an exhibit about moral courage and the importance of standing up for truth regardless of personal cost. The Willowbrook Springs Community Church, where Rebecca's father had once preached and where Rebecca herself had served so faithfully, dedicated a memorial garden in her honor in the spring of 2023. The garden featured a bronze plaque with Rebecca's final journal entry, serving as a permanent reminder of her courage and faith. Dr. Patricia Ann Sullivan, who had discovered the journal, was so moved by Rebecca's story that she began leading a weekly Bible study for young women in the community, focusing on developing the kind of moral courage that Rebecca had demonstrated. The study group, which they named Rebecca's Light, grew rapidly and eventually expanded to include women from several neighboring communities. On September 15, 2022, exactly 50 years after Rebecca's disappearance, Willowbrook Springs held its first annual Rebecca Morrison Day, a community-wide celebration of courage, truth, and faith. The event included a morning worship service at the church, an afternoon of community service projects, and an evening candlelight vigil at Rebecca's Memorial Garden. The keynote speaker for the first Rebecca Morrison Day was Jonathan Morrison, Rebecca's younger brother, who had traveled from his home in Washington, D.C. where he served as a federal prosecutor. Now 65 years old, Jonathan bore a striking resemblance to his father and carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized the Morrison family. My sister Rebecca taught me that truth is not negotiable, Jonathan told the assembled crowd. She showed me that when we discover injustice, we cannot simply look the other way and hope someone else will deal with it. She demonstrated that sometimes God calls us to sacrifice everything for what is right, and that such sacrifice is never in vain. Jonathan went on to reveal that Rebecca's courage had inspired his entire career in law enforcement and prosecution. Every case I've worked, every corrupt official I've helped convict, every victim I've fought for, all of it has been motivated by my sister's example. She died when she was 17 years old, but her influence has shaped 50 years of my life and work. Sarah Morrison Chen, Rebecca's younger sister who had become Dr. Sarah Chen after marrying a fellow counselor, spoke about how Rebecca's faith had sustained their family through decades of grief and loss. Rebecca never got to live the life she had planned, Sarah said, but she lived the life God called her to live. She never got to attend college, never got married, never had children of her own. But she touched more lives and made more difference in her 17 years than most people do in a full lifetime. The evening candlelight vigil was a deeply moving experience, with hundreds of people holding candles as they walked from the church to Rebecca's memorial garden. Many of the participants were too young to have known Rebecca personally, but they had grown up hearing her story and had been inspired by her example of moral courage. As the community gathered in the memorial garden, Detective Rodriguez read excerpts from Rebecca's journal, sharing her words of faith and forgiveness with a new generation. The vigil concluded with the singing of "Amazing Grace," Rebecca's favorite hymn, as participants placed their candles around the memorial plaque. In the months following the first Rebecca Morrison Day, the impact of Rebecca's rediscovered journal continued to reverberate throughout Willowbrook Springs and beyond. Several universities began using Rebecca's story in their ethics courses, teaching students about the importance of moral courage and the responsibility to speak truth to power. A Christian publishing house approached the Morrison family about publishing Rebecca's complete journal along with the story of her investigation and sacrifice. The resulting book, Light in the Darkness, The Rebecca Morrison Story, became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a television movie that introduced Rebecca's story to a national audience. The financial crimes that Rebecca had exposed 50 years earlier also had contemporary implications. Legal scholars examining her evidence discovered that some of the stolen money had never been recovered, and that the statute of limitations had not expired on certain civil claims. This led to successful lawsuits that resulted in significant settlements for the community organizations that had been defrauded, with the money being used to establish scholarship funds and community improvement projects in Rebecca's memory. Perhaps most importantly, Rebecca's story inspired a new generation of young people to take active roles in fighting corruption and injustice in their own communities. The Rebecca's Light Bible study groups that had started in Willowbrook Springs began forming in other towns and cities, creating a network of young women committed to moral courage and ethical leadership. By 2024, 2 years after the discovery of Rebecca's journal, Willowbrook Springs had been transformed from a community still haunted by a 50-year-old tragedy into a place of hope and inspiration. The town that had once been known primarily for corruption and murder was now recognized as a model of how communities could learn from their past and build a better future. The old Morrison parsonage, where Rebecca had grown up and where she had hidden her final testimony, became a pilgrimage site for people seeking inspiration for their own moral struggles. The Sullivan family graciously allowed visitors to see Rebecca's former bedroom, which they had converted into a small shrine featuring photographs of Rebecca, excerpts from her journal, and a guest book where visitors could leave their own reflections and prayers. One of the most frequent visitors to the shrine was Jennifer Blackwood Thompson, Rebecca's childhood best friend who had become a renowned social worker and advocate for crime victims. Now in her 70s, Jennifer had spent her entire career trying to make amends for her father's crimes and to honor Rebecca's memory through service to others. "Rebecca was the best person I ever knew," Jennifer often told visitors to the shrine. She could have lived a safe, comfortable life, could have ignored the evil she discovered and focused on her own plans and dreams. Instead, she chose to sacrifice everything for truth and justice. "I've spent 50 years trying to live up to her example, and I still fall short every day." As Willowbrook Springs continued to heal and grow, the community embraced Rebecca's legacy as a source of strength and guidance. Her journal entries were frequently quoted in church sermons, graduation speeches, and community meetings. Her example of moral courage was cited by local leaders as they worked to ensure that the corruption and secrecy of the past could never take root again. The Tennessee governor officially proclaimed September 15 as Rebecca Morrison Day throughout the state, encouraging schools and organizations to teach her story and to discuss the importance of ethical leadership and moral courage. The proclamation noted that Rebecca's sacrifice had not only exposed corruption in one small town but had also inspired generations of citizens to take active roles in protecting their communities from injustice. On September 15, 2024, 52 years after Rebecca's disappearance, the Willowbrook Springs Community Church unveiled a new stained glass window in Rebecca's honor. The window depicted a young woman holding a candle, with rays of light emanating from the flame to illuminate the darkness around her. At the bottom of the window was inscribed Rebecca's final words from her journal: "The truth will prevail, and light will overcome darkness." Reverend Michael Paul Anderson, the current pastor of Willowbrook Springs Community Church, delivered a powerful sermon at the window dedication ceremony. Rebecca Morrison shows us that God sometimes calls ordinary people to do extraordinary things, he said. She was just a 17-year-old girl, but she had the courage of a lion and the faith of a saint. Her light continues to shine in this community and around the world, proving that one person willing to stand for truth can change everything. As the ceremony concluded and the congregation filed past the new stained glass window, many stopped to pray and to reflect on Rebecca's legacy. Children who had grown up hearing her story pointed excitedly at the window and retold her story to younger siblings. Teenagers contemplated what it would mean to have Rebecca's kind of courage in their own lives. Adults recommitted themselves to the principles of truth and justice that Rebecca had died defending. The impact of Rebecca Morrison's story extended far beyond Willowbrook Springs. FBI training academies began using her case as an example of how corruption could infiltrate small communities and how citizen investigators could play crucial roles in exposing crime. Law enforcement agencies across the country implemented new protocols for protecting witnesses and encouraging citizens to report suspected corruption. Christian organizations around the world embraced Rebecca as a modern martyr, someone who had given her life for truth and justice in the same spirit as the early Christian martyrs. Youth groups studied her journal and discussed how they could apply her example of moral courage to contemporary issues and challenges. Academic researchers examining Rebecca's case noted that her systematic investigation and careful documentation of evidence had been remarkably sophisticated for a 17-year-old with no formal training in law enforcement or journalism. Her methods became a model for citizen journalism and grassroots investigation, inspiring countless individuals to take active roles in holding their leaders accountable. The story of Rebecca Morrison, the girl who disappeared in 1972 and whose hidden journal shocked an entire community 50 years later, became a testament to the power of truth, the importance of moral courage, and the enduring nature of faith in the face of evil. Her sacrifice had exposed corruption, inspired generations, and transformed a community that had been poisoned by secrecy and lies. In her short life, Rebecca Morrison had embodied the biblical principle that all things work together for good to those who love God. Her death had been a tragedy, but it had also been the catalyst for justice, healing, and renewal that continued to bear fruit decades later. The evidence she had hidden so carefully had not only convicted her killers but had also provided a roadmap for building a more just and transparent community. As Willowbrook Springs moved forward into the future, Rebecca's legacy served as both an inspiration and a warning. Her courage reminded citizens of their responsibility to speak truth to power and to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Her faith demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could survive and light could overcome darkness. The girl who had disappeared without a trace in 1972 had left behind the most powerful trace of all, a legacy of moral courage that would continue to inspire and guide future generations long after the details of her particular struggle had faded from memory. Rebecca Morrison had proved that one life lived in service to truth could indeed change the world, one community at a time, one heart at a time, one act of courage at a time.